Hello viewers, today I am with a new topic, that is comparison between micro teaching and traditional teaching. But before going to the comparison between micro teaching and traditional teaching, it is almost necessary to know what is micro teaching and what is traditional teaching. And therefore in the beginning I would like to tell you something about the micro teaching and the traditional teaching. Micro teaching is basically a teacher training technique. It is a technique for effective practice teaching. The educationists across the globe were trying to find out an effective technique for practice teaching, and as a result of that effort, in 1961, in the University of Stanford in the USA, a research project was undertaken with the help of Ford and Catering foundations. This research has resulted a technique, and this particular technique in 1963 was named as micro teaching by D.W. Allen and his companion. So micro teaching is a teacher training technique, not a teaching technique. Micro teaching aims at development of teachers' behavior. It means it aims at modification of teachers' behavior. It primarily devoted to the development of the teaching skills among the student teachers. In micro teaching, we take up one teaching skill at a time, and the student teacher practices one teaching skill under controlled conditions. They get the opportunity for repeated practice until they attain perfection in that particular skill, and thus they get the opportunity to modify the behavior. In micro teaching, we remove the complexities of a normal classroom teaching. We reduce the number of pupils, we reduce the duration of time. We also simplify the content to be taught. Otherwise, or in other words, I should say, in other words, in micro teaching, only 5 to 10 pupils take participate. Means there are only 5 to 10 pupils involved, and the teacher teaches for only to 5 to 10 minutes time, and the subject content is also simplified. Only one aspect of the subject content is dealt with, which has a clear relation with the teaching skill under practice. So micro teaching is basically a teacher training tactic. It is a highly individualized program. In micro teaching, we have the opportunity to get immediate feedback. It means that at the end of teaching, the student teacher get immediate feedback from the teacher educator. He also get the opportunity to see his own performance in the video recording. So he get the necessary feedback, and accordingly he can change his plan and then reteach and get again feedback, and this particular cycle continues until the attainment of perfection or attainment of mastery in that particular skill. And this aspect indicates that there must be a cycle, and this cycle is known as microcycle. This microcycle consists of the three phases of micro teaching, that is knowledge acquisition phase, skill acquisition phase, and transfer acquisition phase. These three phases together consist of the microcycle. The microcycle consists of planning, then teaching, then feedback, then again planning means replanning, reteaching, refeedback. So these cycles continue until the student teacher attain mastery in that particular skill. So micro teaching is very helpful for the student teacher to learn the art of teaching. The micro teaching has various advantages. The first advantage is that the micro teaching is a real teaching because it's involved subject content, pupils, it is carried out for a time, etc. And it is also conducted in real teaching environment, maybe in miniature. So micro teaching is a highly individualized program. In micro teaching, every individual teacher get attention to his capacities. Micro teaching also um, gives us the opportunity to get the feedback. Okay, then in a micro teaching also help us to control the practices, increase control of the practices. We can practice a single teaching skill at a time. Um, Micro teaching has also many disadvantages. The include disadvantages include number one, it is time consuming. So the practice of the teaching skill is also very tiresome at some time. It is mechanical. There is no scope for creativity for the teacher, and the teacher educator who will give the feedback must be well trained. So um, well trained educators are not readily available. Micro teaching is rather mechanical, and micro teaching alone is not sufficient. It requires other training technique also, which help in preparation of the teacher, that makes him effective at macro level. So this is a little about micro teaching in a nutshell. Now I would like to throw light on the, the traditional teaching. The traditional teaching or conventional teaching is that kind of teaching which has been in vogue for a long time. In our schools and colleges, we can have um, the presence of this kind of teaching. In traditional teaching, we see that it is teacher dominated, its activities are teachers directed. Here, teacher is active, pupils remain passive, because the lecture method is highly used in conventional or traditional teaching. Here, teacher is the doer of action. Everything takes place at his instruction, and therefore It is almost just like pouring in information. There is little scope for learning and more scope for teaching. In traditional teaching, the chalk and talk method is used. Technique like repetition, memorization are used by the student. In traditional teaching, emphasis is given on pouring in information, giving knowledge, and this knowledge this knowledge is also provided to the student teacher, um, means to the pupils to pass the examination. And therefore, after passing the examination, the knowledge procured before the examination is forgotten uh, by the pupils. In traditional teaching, there is no scope for creative activity. The pupils get less opportunity for creative activities. There is no scope for collaborative or group learning. The teacher, as I have just said, is the mode of dispenser of knowledge. He is not the facilitator of knowledge, he is the dispenser of knowledge. Whatever he does, there is final. It has been often seen that the teachers are reluctant to use the technological tools for better dissemination of knowledge. In fact, in conventional or traditional teaching, there is no scope or nor it is even used in the classroom. Most shockingly, there is no perfect alignment of the objective activities and assessment in the teacher in the traditional teaching or conventional teaching. So conventional teaching is not so healthy for the education of the student. Again, we all have seen that in traditional teaching or conventional teaching, the classrooms are crowded. We see a lot of pupils in the classroom. Even in a class, there are 100 students. And in conventional or traditional teaching, there are a lot of complexities. The complexities in the subject content undertaken, a lot of behavioral problems, management problem on the part of the teacher in the classroom. There is a lack of facilities for effective teaching, and the time is also 40 to 45 minutes. So these are some of the properties of conventional teaching. We have to remove the defects of conventional teaching in order to achieve proper objectives of education. So now I want to compare both micro teaching and traditional or conventional teaching. By now you must have realized that there is less similarities and more differences between micro teaching and traditional teaching. The similarity being is that micro teaching and traditional teaching both are real teaching. because they involve teacher, student, time, and content. In micro teaching, there are pupils. In traditional teaching too, there are pupils. Means both teaching is done with the pupils. Means where pupils are involved. Only this is the similarity, means that both are real teaching, both involve student, both involve subject content, both involve time. Another similarity, of course, I have forgotten to tell you. That similarity is that both aims at modification of behavior. Of course, there means recipient means whose behavior is to be modified. They are different parties, but both teaching, micro teaching as well as traditional teaching, aims at modifying the behavior pattern. To accept these two similarities, there are lots of dissimilarities and differences. Differences are more than similarities. The differences are micro teaching is a training technique, whereas traditional teaching not aims at aims at training aims at training. They imparts knowledge, understanding, skill, attitude, application among the student. So it is not and micro teaching is a specific training techniques for the teacher training, while traditional teaching is not. In micro teaching, we try to modify the behavior of the student teacher or the teacher. But in traditional teaching, we try to modify the behavior pattern of the pupils. The micro teaching is done under control environment, but traditional teaching is not possible in control environment. Micro teaching is a simplified form of teaching because there is less complexities, but traditional teaching is full of complexities. The teacher has no control over some variables which aids to his difficulties in the classroom. Micro teaching pay attention to one skill at a time. It means that in micro teaching we practice teaching skill. In traditional teaching we never do that. In traditional teaching we impart knowledge, understanding, skill, application, attitude to the student for the desired modification of behavior. Micro teaching is conducted for 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, and traditional teaching is conducted for 40 to 60 minutes somewhere, or 40 to 45 minutes. Sorry, micro teaching is conducted for 5 to 10 minutes and traditional teaching is conducted for 40 to 45 minutes. In micro teaching, we have only a group of students or pupils consisting 5 to 10, but in traditional teaching or conventional teaching, the class size or the number of pupils may be 40 to 60, and even in some classroom we may see 100 or more than 100. Micro teaching is highly individualized program, of course training program, while conventional teaching deals with a large number of pupils. The individualization of instruction is almost not completely possible in conventional teaching. In micro teaching, the objective of teaching is specified in behavioral terms, but in traditional teaching, that is not done. In micro teaching, there is a provision of feedback, but in traditional teaching, feedback facility is not immediately available. In micro teaching, supervisor has a specified role. The supervisor help the student teacher by giving appropriate advice. But in traditional teaching, the role of supervisor is not very clear, and at times there is no supervisor at all. Micro teaching is almost mechanical. There is no scope of creativity, but traditional teaching, there is a scope of creativity for the little bit creativity rather than micro teaching for the teacher. In micro teaching, interaction that takes place between the student teacher and the pupils can be analyzed objectively, but in a traditional teaching there is uh, not uh, that is not possible. The interaction is not even studied. So these are some of the differences between micro teaching and traditional teaching. We have to explore more points by going through good reference book. So after going through both the topics, micro teaching and traditional teaching, we will get the proper uh, and comprehensive understanding of the similarities between micro teaching and traditional teaching. My attempt is only a small initiative. I hope all of you will be benefited what I have just tried to share with you. Thank you very much.